Okay, well, it is 5:31 and I've got a couple minutes of housekeeping and introduction to do, so I'll go ahead and get started right now. Let me welcome everyone and say thank you for attending today's environmental ethics seminar. This is, as I always say in these introductions, this is part of our environmental ethics seminar series, which is held every semester here at UGA. And these seminars began back in 1983 with the establishment of the Environmental Ethics Certificate Program, or EECP. And the Environmental Ethics Certificate Program is an interdisciplinary program that prepares students to synthesize ideas from a wide variety of perspectives to solve complex environmental problems, both in theory and in practice. And as far as I know, it was the first certificate of its type in the United States. And we're certainly proud to still be going strong more than 35 years later. And certainly the goals of the program remain as relevant and urgent today as they did at its beginning. So this is our, I think, fourth seminar of this semester. We have two more events coming up in the remaining month or so of this spring semester. On April 13th, we will have a Zoom discussion with Dorinda Dahlmeyer, former director of the Environmental Ethics Certificate Program and producer of the documentary Cultivating the Wild. And that'll be on Tuesday, April 13th at 5:30. You can find more information about that and all of our events on the University of Georgia College of Environment and Design website. On April 20th at 5:30 is our last seminar of this semester, and we'll have Jenny Hoffner, who is Vice President of River Conservation Strategies at American Rivers, as our speaker for that event. As has been our tradition, these seminars are open to the public, and they're also required for students who are enrolled in the Environmental Ethics Seminar course for credit. And as we get into the fall semester, once we've got a critical mass of vaccinated people, we might start doing these in person again with receptions afterwards. But for the last 12 months, we've been doing these seminars virtually, which actually has been a great way to bring people in from far and wide. And it's been, I think in the future, no matter if we get back to face-to-face seminars, I think we'll still find a way to present these virtually so that we can get that attendance from folks that are far away. So it's great to have people joining us. In this session, it's a webinar format that you all attendees are muted, but at the end of the talk, when we have time for Q&A, if you raise your hand using the tool at the bottom of your screen, I can call on you and unmute you, and then you can ask questions directly, or if you'd like to use the chat or Q&A features, I'll monitor that and can repeat your questions out loud if we want to do it that way. So with all that said, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Fausto Sarmiento. Dr. Sarmiento is a professor of mountain science in the geography department here at UGA, and he's director of the Neotropical Montology Collaboratory. He's been involved in major disciplinary and institutional efforts to promote sustainable development in mountain environments and in restructuring evaluation criteria used for landscape conservation in the tropical Andes. Currently, he's Deputy Vice Chair of the Mountain Biome of the World Commission of Protected Areas, and he's a member of the Protected Landscapes Task Force in the World Conservation Union. Dr. Sarmiento's publications and recognitions are way too vast for me to list, but they are surely extensive and important. He's a consultant to UNESCO and to the IUCN in matters related to conservation of mountain ecosystems and cultural landscapes. He's been invited to be an international juror for Nature Conservation Awards, and his work has included technical assistance to universities around the world, including universities in Mexico, Puerto Rico, Trinidad, Costa Rica, Venezuela, Colombia, and the list goes on. So I could go on for this entire time talking about what Dr. Sarmiento has done, but at this point I will say it's an honor to welcome you, Dr. Sarmiento, and I'll turn it over to you at this point. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much to you for this kind presentation and to all of the members of the audience. It is very interesting to remember when the certificate program started, I was a student And it was very interesting for me to be part of this group of scholars who met in the Founders Garden to discuss issues related to nature, ecology, and science in general. Particularly, I am fond of the memories of Frank Golly, who somehow woke my attention into this boundary between nature and culture. And after that, I realized that being an ecologist myself, I was a geographer at heart. And now that I have passed several years teaching in the geography department, I discovered very fondly that I am a philosopher at heart. And so in that sense, let me present to you my ideas about earth ethics in Tropandean mountains. This is particularly related to the notion that we are developing the Montology of community-based conservation in this part of the world. So I am presenting you these different topics. The contents are listed in the subheadings that will actually help us guide a little bit our understanding of this new wave of understanding mountain science, particularly in relation to the tropical Andes. I will finish with the coda, and then, as Alfie mentioned, we will have opportunity for a Q&A at the end. Let's start by looking at this very interesting idea presented by François-René de Chateaubriand. When forests precede civilizations, deserts follow them. And this is a very interesting and provocative thought, even though this was actually published in an opus posthum when he died. The notion that deserts follow forests, but then they are not there. They don't remain like deserts. There may be a possibility for forests to come back, maybe. There may be the possibility that forests change to something else. And that's precisely the notion that I would like to imbue my presentation this afternoon with, the pulsing paradigm. And the reason why you will see those yellow lines waving across the screen is precisely because the notion of landscape ecology is to understand that we are responding to a cyclic etiology. Everything in nature and culture comes like in waves. This is Andean philosophy is known as Pachacutic, the notion that everything changes, but everything remains the same. It's a very interesting approach for our understanding of science as related to our understanding of mountains. And so, as you well know, the difference between reductionistic science with a deterministic point of view that René Descartes presented to the world somehow was contended by this rational criticism presented by the notion of having holism instead of reductionism and having possibilism instead of determinism. Many scientists of the caliber of Baruch Spinoza had come with this idea of the integration of knowledge instead of the separation of knowledge into smaller pieces to try to understand the whole. The idea is to grasp a conciliant view of Earth in order to really grasp our understanding of nature. But we start understanding nature back in the era of exploration, when Franco Davila, who was a person who was born in what is now Ecuador, in Guayaquil, brought to Spain collections of animals and plants that helped him to develop the Royal Cabinet of Natural History in Madrid. Later on, most of the scientists are curious explorers at the time, went to see these marvelous big leaves that have never been seen in Europe, these very mysterious animals, like, for instance, a llama or a condor. And that has generated this interest in studying this natural history. One of the most important contributions for the understanding of mountains in our hemisphere came from the work of Charles-Marie de la Condamine, who, helped by the Pedro Vicente Maldonado group in Ecuador, helped measure the quadrant of the meridian to determine that the planet indeed was round. And that happened precisely in the territory that is now called Ecuador. The name is actually responding to this particular expedition. La Condamine had pointed the starting of science in relation to characterizing the site. He was very much into using metrics, cataloging taxonomy, and applying what they call haptic naturalism, meaning that everything that you are able to touch, you can grasp, you can capture and measure, that will be scientifically acknowledged. And so after that, we realized that throughout these discourses, we definitely have in the background mountains as archetype. And when the Europeans came to the New World and discovered that fantastic array of different environments in the tropical mountains, we definitely associate the notion of verticality as part of the metageography, not only of the people as individuals, but also as societies. We have developed this mountain metaphor, the metaphorical mountain that we see ourselves in our own personal lives, the lives of institutions, the efforts of countries. Everything can be associated with a mountain theme. And not only that, because you can see here on the right-hand corner, mountains are coupled natural human systems that function basically in two modes, with continuous presses that are constant through time, and also to sporadic pulses. These pulses somehow happen out of environmental stochasticity maybe, but they are often related to catastrophes and risks such as fire, flood, avalanches. However, in the social science, we also find these pulses hitting the mountain areas with crises such as, for instance, economic crises. In these mountain areas, you find mostly isolated, marginalized, complex, diverse, and remote systems that are mainly associated with the existence of barriers, borders, and hazards. Understanding that this is a scenario where people have adapted very well to live their lives among these, creating what they call a biophysical and social scenario. The current bibliography that we have in order to understand mountains relates mostly to the ecosystem services. And most people realize that almost everything that is coming from the mountains is actually of use for almost 75% of the population in the world that depends on the ecosystem services of mountains, associated not only to food, fuel, and other energy resources, but also cultural heritage, the identity markers. They are actually imbued in what we consider to be tourism and recreation, all the way to incorporate aesthetics and spiritual values. Talking about these very important ecosystem, environmental, and landscape services, we are confronted with this notion of value. So how can we think that mountains have value, particularly in the tropical Andes? That brings me to the notion of Suitogaku that is illustrated in the left-hand side corner here, whereby in a Venn diagram, it is being demonstrated that we can fuse the spiritual world, the natural world, and the human world into understanding the religious value, the symbolic value, and the conservation value of the landscape that we are trying to manage. So applying this Venn diagram to the notion of scientific understanding, we realize the fact that if we pick one discipline, let's take the example of genetics, for instance, we are understanding mountains from a disciplinary perspective. If we take two or more disciplines, we understand genomics, for instance, in a multidisciplinary perspective. If we incorporate another discipline or more, we have this idea that by the contribution of these previous disciplines, something else emerges. It is actually an emergent property in science that could represent a much better understanding of the whole. Yet in the last transition into the transdisciplinary studies, we understand that it is not just the integration of knowledge, the accumulation of different information and data that could give us a clear vision, but it is the understanding of the cross-cutting approach, meaning that we could get to know the system completely. And that's what I call Montology, to describe the transdisciplinary science of mountains. Montology, therefore, goes to the core of this interaction between the humanities, the social sciences, the physical sciences, in what we could consider to be a suitogaku of mountains. On that notion, remember that geography basically relied on the idea of scale. And if we scale mountain science, it is very obvious to represent the different steps of disciplinary work, such as, for instance, when we pick one particular discipline, we could have the collection of intradisciplinary studies or sub-disciplines, if you will. If we go one step up, we enter the multidisciplinary frame, where juxtaposition, sequenciation, and coordination of information is needed. Then we can jump another level in the scale of mountain science into the interdisciplinary realm, where the integration, interaction, connection, focusing, and combination of data and information is required for our increased understanding of the mountain system. Yet now, with the current trend of transdisciplinarity, we allow the contribution of these many disciplines to develop regenerative co-creation of the topic. We allow transcendence, transgression, translations, and transformation. And that is the beauty of Montology, because being the transdisciplinary science of mountains, we favor the complementation of information, the integration of these disciplines, and the collaboration of the people who are eager to understand better the tropical mountain areas. So in this regard, you may think of a tropical mountain to be a very well-connected system, is interdependent, is working very well, just like the cog model that was developed by Newton. However, now in the 21st century, more and more scholars are tending to incorporate the notion of convergence. And if we have convergent science, we are all using our own individual disciplines, converging into one specific purpose of a study. And that later on requires integration. To conclude, in what E.O. Wilson already mentioned, the need for biodiversity science be taken as consilience. So in consilience, we reach that particular realm whereby not only Western science, but also ancestral wisdom can be collated and can be grasped in order to better understand a mountain from different perspectives. So in this regard, Montology is placed in this different reality of 2 or 3 fronts, whereby the geoliteracy is presented with the eco-literacy, as well as the sopholiteracy. So in order for us to understand mountains, we have to develop critical thinking, and we have to be critical in, critical of, and critical through to grasp this interaction of Montology. I have to mention something that is actually pending in this corner, which is numeracy. How numeracy could be integrated in these 3 levels, because it goes on each and every one. You have to apply numeracy even when you are in the philosophy realm. You have to apply mathematics when you are in the ecological realm. And you have to have the use of numbers and figures in the understanding of the geological realm. And that is precisely the complicated notion of the transdisciplinary science of mountains. In other words, we are definitely facing innovative congruence of science. We have to understand that mountains are now considered to be sentient landscapes. Mountology, therefore, is the noetic science of mountains. In mountains, there should be consilience. Mountains should reflect a pluriverse, not only a universe or multiverse, but pluriverse. Montology is the transdisciplinary science of mountains. Montology is the convergent, integrative study of mountains. Mountains are socioecological production landscapes, and Montology translates the ecological legacies of mountainscapes. Mountains are biocultural heritage territories. You see, I have collated these ideas, each of which could represent a specific lecture topic, in order for us to understand the need to change our paradigm about the tropical mountains and see how is it that we understand the entire pluriverse of mountains. More and more publications are coming out recently in relation to bringing about Montology into the framework that we in geography are utilizing. Particularly in the Andes, it has been actually an effort for many decades already, because we are confronted with a very difficult question. Back in the 1970s, Robert May had already posed this question in relation to the term community. We are talking about community-based conservation. But 3 decades ago or more, the notion that in ecology, the concept of community is quite complex and requires a lot of nuance. So is a community still a community? There are many types of communities. And where you are working with community-based conservation, you have to be very sensitive to the group that you are incorporated into the project. Sometimes people use the term stakeholders just to generalize the different participants in a project, but they may or may not be a community. They may or may represent different communities, such as, for instance, in the picture you see in the upper left corner. There's a community of learners. Oftentimes, the young people have no say in political decisions, but they will become the political leaders of the future. And so if we hit the community of learners in order to incorporate this new thinking of mountains, it may be the fact that in a couple of decades, they will be making the change in favor of this holistic view of mountains. Take a look at the picture in the bottom right corner of the screen. You see here a different community. You may think that this community represents an Andean people. They are not indigenous people. Most of them are mestizos. Are they part of the community associated with the Catholic tradition of parading the saints? I don't know. Maybe they are part of a school act that is just putting up for a specific day during the year. This is precisely the difficulty on defining community. Not even in landscape design, when we try to incorporate the needs and wants of a specific group that we are targeting our architectural design, we must define a community. And so next time we think about conservation, if it is a community based, we have to realize what community are we talking about. And this has been actually the notion that I have been pushing for a better understanding of the lexicology, or the jargon, if you will, of mountain studies. I started with a small dictionary of ecology in Ecuador. It grew to becoming a dictionary of ecology, landscape conservation, and sustainable development in Latin America. And now, thanks to the internet, we have these ideas expanded into the global network. So because of this need of understanding, my colleague Larry Froelich and I came to this very big undertaking of preparing a book that treats geography transdisciplinarity, and sustainability in an innovative way. The innovation that is presented here is basically twofold. One is that the transdisciplinary science of mountains in particular require a revisiting of the notion of regenerative development. Not only sustainability has to be taken into account in order for our plans for conservation to be successful, but we have to allow the system to regenerate itself. It is not possible just to maintain the same status all throughout the homeostasis of the system forever. No, we have to allow the system to reload itself, to reshift, and then incorporate new factors that allow the development process to continue. And because of that, the theory presented by Fletcher et al. In a new future for conservation is actually a very important challenge in the 21st century, because they talk about the principles of post-growth conservation. And in post-growth conservation, we are facing quite a watershed changes to the way in which we have been trained in ecology and in the way in which we have been behaving in society. Such as, for instance, the first and foremost idea on this post-growth conservation is to allow conviviality. It is very interesting to realize how poorly designed conservation programs have incorporated notions of static groups of people living in specific time scales that have to be conserved like they are. Think about indigenous populations of indigenous reservations. This is absolutely contrary to the new way of the decolonial thinking of conviviality. Also, we are not just talking about the biodiversity. Not only animals and plants have to be incorporated in the picture, but the animals and plants that can be found in places of the tropical mountains happen to be related to ancestral management. I call this indigenous engineering of mountain systems, by which domesticated plants and domesticated animals have been used. Sometimes these animals had been let loose, they became feral animals. And so if we go and visit the mountains today, we capture a picture that is not only animals and plants, but that animals and plants that had been somehow manufactured or manipulated by people. Therefore, the notion of biocultural diversity has to be the norm in the conservation of these programs in the Andes. Important enough, the decommodification of nature. We have to stop looking at the mountains as the place where gold exists or where copper have to be mined. The decommodification of the resources of mountains comes very much as a response to the local original people who have claimed the fact that mountains for them are not just places where a stockpile of resources exist, but they are part of themselves. Sometimes they consider the mother with the idea of Pachamama, but the notion in general is that as sentient landscapes, the tropical mountains have to be decommodified. And that implies a fight between the notions of development that we have in our traditional capitalistic modern world versus the notion of the sustainability of the indigenous lifestyle. Another important consideration is that we have to value the sacred in nature. Oftentimes, big national parks or protected areas have been designed with the idea of protect the animals and plants that live therein. And the notions that indigenous people have considered places within these areas as sacred, such as, for instance, a waterfall or a cave or a sacred grove, have not been considered in the past. Nowadays, those areas are becoming prime targets for conservation. That is something that we have to realize in this process of decolonizing conservation programs. The idea is that through the application of Western science, the ecologists of the past have given us tools that have been written by and have been exploited by other people, not those locals that knew the system beforehand. And so by decolonizing our scholarship, we are now reaching new areas of study. We are reaching new frontiers of knowledge that had incorporated this new understanding of mountain systems. Also, we have to understand that social and environmental justice will become the paradigm driver of establishing conservation areas in the future. We have to think into the redistribution of resources associated with areas that had to be conserved and other areas that had to be managed in other ways. Subsidiarity becomes a predicament of the global South. After these changes that the growing economy has allowed for post-growth conservation, the rich countries of the North, who had been, by the way, the culprits for the problems associated with the global climate change, for instance, will have to subsidize small countries in the global South who have no access to resources to deal with these changes that they have not caused. And so the notion of subsidiarity is becoming prevalent in the conversations of local NGOs that claim the need of this extra funding or extra help coming from the global North to make sure we actually inhabited a planet in which environmental and social justice and the redistribution of wealth has been accommodated. The global connections that the internet era allows for us to go one step further into our understanding of mountains must actually align conservation and resistance of these groups. In the communities that we find in the tropical Andes, people are stubborn in maintaining their cultural identity. And many anthropologists, ethnographers, and ecologists have gone and visited them and wonder for this resistance and also the resilience that some of the groups have shown in order to withstand the frenetic change brought by the global economy. So in a nutshell, with Fletcher and his collaborators are trying to argue is that we have to redefine the power relations. And power relations, as you may well know, is a key word for political ecology. On that regard, it is imperative for us to start looking into ways to incorporate these alternative explanations for the ideas of conserving these very important landscapes. I call it mountainscapes precisely because those are the landscapes of the mountains, and they are unique in many, many senses. One of the angles that I have taken is actually identifying the micro-refugia and how the local community can be activated or incentivated to consider those small places as important loci for conservation initiatives. We have done in several places in northern Peru and southern Ecuador, and I have several colleagues throughout the region who are working not only with campesino communities, farmers in the highlands, but also indigenous people that are the original inhabitants of these lands that have incorporated these very challenging notions of the transdisciplinary science of mountains, because it's not easy to integrate the natural system and the cultural system together. We definitely call mountains as socioecological systems. It is a very easy word, but it's a very hard, difficult concept because those systems are not the same. And particularly if we are trying to incorporate the nested ecological hierarchies in the non-nested panarchies of the social systems, we have to stretch the adaptive change cycle that you see here in these phases. So resilience thinking in the social system could be incorporated into the resilience concept in the physical system, but it requires a lot of buying in by the local community. The local community have to have opportunities to expose themselves to these new ideas of conservation, such as, for instance, in the left, you have a case study on the Imbakucha Watershed with the Otavalo Runacuna, an original people group of northern Ecuador, that have highlighted the importance of conserving sacred sites. For them, the idea of establishing a geopark in this province, the geopark is called Imbabura Geopark, is secondary to the need of protecting their sacred sites, such as, for instance, the sacred tree of the Otavalo in one of the hills where Pucara had been constructed, and they actually still have this connection with their ancestors through visits to this tree. Something that my colleague Ricardo Rossi and his collaborators put together in a very interesting book is called Earth Stewardship. Oftentimes in ecology, we don't talk about stewardship, we only talk about conservation, with the notion of that the ecologists and the anthropologists have a toolbox whereby they can open and use any available tool in order to conserve, quote unquote, the system as it is now. This is done precisely to prevent further damage in the future. However, the notion of stewardship is contrary to that. In stewardship, you don't have a toolbox. You have actually a coffer of very important tools that can be joined together in a fantastic way to move the system forward. You have to orient, you have to guide, you have to innovate. You don't really have to conserve, you have to move along with the flow of the system. And so because of that, I was able to contribute with these ideas of earth ethics by looking at rediscovering Andean sacred sites, for which community-based conservation practices was actually very helpful. Oftentimes we don't integrate the affiliation of religions into the planning of conservation projects. However, it was very clear that if we incorporate the notion of a sacred element in the landscape, that will be highlighted as actually worth of protection. Not only immobile element in the landscape, I am also interested in looking at water. And this is very appropriate because throughout the Andes, many mountain communities value water highly. And so the reason why it is so valuable is not just because, you know, they can utilize it for irrigation or they can drink it and so forth. Some of these groups, particularly, for instance, the Shuar that lives in very proximity to the Sangay National Park, they are known as the people of the waterfalls. The origin myth of the Shuar is precisely they have been born out of the relationship of a snake in a waterfall. So for them, waterfalls are sacred, and water coming from the mountain is sacred. So these new dimensions bring about this interesting idea of incorporating other forms of epistemologies that allow us to understand mountains better. The epistemology of science oftentimes is attributed to have developed by Alexander von Humboldt. And you see how Alexander von Humboldt sometimes is called a geographer. This is the father of many disciplines in geography. Sometimes he is called a geologist. He is called a natural historian. But he is actually the first ecologist. And the father of ecology presented this notion that nature prior to Humboldt was not originally stated as such. The idea of nature had been presented in a very telling book that I highly recommend you to read by Andrea Wolf, is the fact that because of Alexander von Humboldt's trip to the mountains in the New World, he discovered this something that was able to put together as how the universe functioned. And so he invented the notion of nature and the idea of relating climate, for instance, with the plant formations, the altitudinal belts, all of that had been somehow the baseline information for many mountain studies, starting in the late 1800s. I have been very fervent in facilitating this notion that the Ecuadorian mountains are the birthplace of ecology, precisely because of the importance of the Alexander von Humboldt work in letting us know how the universe functions. But mountains around the world are actually facing many difficulties, many problems. Back in 1999, two of the foremost mountain geographers in the world published this book about a global priority for the mountains of the world. Because of this book, the United Nations actually in the year 2002 was able to determine that mountains will be celebrated with an international year. So the year 2002 was the International Year of the Mountains. And after that, they established the International Mountain Day in December 11th of each year. So after that, I was able to bring about the same information presented in the English language from Jack Ives and Bruno Messerly book into the Spanish audiences. So I edited this interesting book about the mountains of the world with a little tint into the Latin American perspectives. And two of the most important additions to the Latin American perspectives was precisely the idea of community-based conservation, the integration of these indigenous views of the world, and how the landscapes that we see in the Andes, such as, for instance, in the picture that you see there, is a collection of a hybrid reality between nature and culture. In the Andes, therefore, we are dealing now with the understanding of two fronts. The time scale is not just time, it's historicity. And the spatial scale is not just a space, but is a spatiality. Because it is not important only the time that is passing in days, in months, or in years. What really matters is the changes that are experienced throughout these periods. Same thing in the space. It's not important only how the space has been modified in order to convert it into place, but in reality is the process by which these changes have taken place. And so therefore, at the base of the new scholarly view of the decolonial mountains, we have the political ecology areas emphasizing our understanding of mountainscapes in the Andes. Concepts like biocultural heritage, critical biogeography, all of those are now the drivers for our understanding of mountains. These understanding, of course, have morphed through the years, and the changing models in the mountainscapes have been illustrated by these three ideas. We have eco prefixes yesterday, eco prefixes today, and eco prefixes tomorrow. Most of you will identify the picture of Professor Eugene Odum, with whom I was very honored to publish a book about ecology being the bridge between science and society. At that time, in the eco of yesterday, we look into succession theory of Clemens. We highlight the individual fitness of Gleason. We emphasize the interactions in biomes. We always try to find a structure and order in nature. We observe the laws of ecology and certain biogeographical rules. And we tend to use science in order to do experiments and mapping. In one word, we tend to generalize the information that science has provided for us to understand better the ecosystems. And so in the next phase, the eco of today, we have changed the models. Ecology is not ecology anymore. It is landscape ecology. We have incorporated the ideas of biodiversity of Wilson, the non-equilibrium theory of Bofkin, including the entropy factors and chaos theory. We have allowed bias of patterns and fuzzy logic to act, separating the notions in spheres and flows. When the analysis actually came back because of the geographic information systems, geospatial analysis, geospatial studies came to the fore in landscape ecology, prompting the separation of domains and specialization, because the entire effort was to locate landscapes and try to understand landscapes. Now, in the eco of tomorrow, we have this very interesting dimension that we are now actually witnessing throughout the world. There is a revival of the indigenous. There is a revalue of the small. There is also a revalue of the local. And so if we apply these criteria for the ecology of tomorrow, we realize that Montology comes very strongly, because relates the notion that science offers us situated knowledge and kinship. Because ecology will give us the explanation to understand manufactured landscapes as hybrid territories. Therefore, they are conceived being socioecological production mountainscapes. We are now dealing with what we consider being ecological legacies. And of course, the last step in this process is to allow the incorporation of noetic sciences in our understanding of the mountainscape. As you can see here, the mountainscape has actually shifted in paradigms. In the past, we were concerned only with the European view of the mountains, meaning separation in altitudinal bands according to the elevation. And they were very descriptive, reductionistic, morphological. They actually tend to separate the zones, conceived them as homeostatic elements. They were divergent, they were static, well-defined, permanent in time, and they were actually very resistant. That is the idea that we have in our former mountain paradigm. After the year 2002 or so, we changed the paradigms. We were able to debunk this paradigm because in the mountain studies of the present, we tried to be analytic and we tried to be holistic. Instead of morphological, we emphasize the physiological. Sometimes they call it functional systems. Instead of homeostasis, we emphasize homeoresis. And we are integrative, convergent, dynamic, adaptable, considering mountains being vulnerable and resilient. So as you can see, is somehow an about face in the way in which we conceive mountains. By breaking the mountain paradigms, I have argued strongly that we definitely have to change our mind for conservation projects. Instead of managing the conservation, we have to consider my writing of the word man-agent, as you can see here in the upper left corner. So these areas, these systems have been man-agent. And because of that, we had to revisit what we knew about the geography of Latin America. And we have to realize that there is a syncretism in the transformation of the rural landscapes in the Andes, oftentimes driven by the need of restoration ecology. So having a strategy for restoration ecology should be now an important part, sine qua non component of conservation planning. Here in this illustration, I am trying to present a very complex idea of the resilience of the tropical Andes, particularly in defining how these mountains could be considered stable systems when vulnerability and the adaptations to change are found within the limits of the resilience of the mountain. You see how most people separate a natural system away from the cultural system. But in reality, we need to couple those. By coupling natural and cultural systems, we analyze the fact that we have some stabilizing processes and destabilizing processes. For instance, climate change destabilizes the process, but the notion of ecological redundancy counter that. Same thing in the cultural affair of building terraces, grazing with camelids. Those are stabilizing processes if you compare them to the agricultural intensification or the burning of the Andean forest to open up areas for pasture. So the idea is also that coupling the systems between what we have in the cityscapes versus the reality of the mountainscapes. In both areas, we may find the complications of abandonment and colonization in the natural system. But in the cultural system, we also could see abandonment and colonization in these new cityscapes. Therefore, tropical mountains have to be framed in the understanding that they are coupled, complex adaptive systems. They are functioning like the Gestalt system that is well known because of this self-reorganization and self-transformation through time. Most anthropologists now are incorporating the idea of rhizomic instead of dendritic relations to bring about the idea that no longer the processes can be driven from the top-down approach. This will be the dendritic approach. Instead, the processes operating in these coupled systems are adapted because of this intricate network of the rhizomes throughout the soil that are actually organizing responses from the bottom up. And so the coupled complex adaptive systems of the mountains in the Andes have to respond to these very interesting differences. Also around the world, we have this idea of the socioecological productive landscapes and seascapes. The English acronym is SEPLS. And one of the most interesting programs worldwide is housed at the University of the United Nations in Tokyo, in Japan, the International Satoyama Program Initiative. Satoyama and Satoumi are two Japanese terms that describe in one word how Sato, which is the village, and Yama, which is the mountain, are actually one entire complex. We cannot separate the culture and the nature together. Same thing happens actually in Satoumi when you have the sea, the coastal areas, and the land. They are unique, cohesive, very much hybrid space. So Satoyama and Satoumi are two of the most interesting models that we have to understand how the sepals function in this coupled complex adaptive system towards resilience in the tropical mountains. So back to this Japanese idea of Suitogaku, I have posited the notion that we incorporate the three indicators of Andean identity that you can have in the tropical Andes, particularly the creation of what we call Andeanity, when you have the measurable, quantifiable physical attributes. You incorporate the Andeanness, which are induced and conceived from sociocultural attributes, and the Andeanitude, when you subduct it and infer from mental imaginaries. By looking at the Inca commandments, the only three commandments that they had, Amaquilla, Amashua, and Amayuya, the interaction of these behaviors create what is known as Aini, that can be loosely translated as reciprocity. But these three factors are interacting within a framework of individual and collective well-being. They are called Tawantin. They are also interacting between passive and active manifestations, such as the Masintin. So this is a dynamic behavioral resonance and the dynamism of the system. And also they are interacting between the attribute and the antipode. Many scholars know this as the complementary dualism, the yin and yang of some of the Asian cultures. In the Andes, that is called Yan and Tin. So the Sarmiento trilemma tried to locate the interaction between these different forces, trying to find Aini in the Andes that may fit very well in the notion of the Suitogaku of Japan, finding the intersection of the spiritual, the human, and the natural into defining what is the value for community-based conservation. Remember that throughout the world, we have actually a clear understanding of the climate change and how it affected the cultural evolution, and how that actually created what is now known as novel ecosystems. Not only that, but we now realize that as a social investment, the people of the past have engineered mountain landscapes. And now, of course, we are dealing with the idea of Doxidiadis for the ecumenopolis in a manufactured landscape. The entire planet is going to be just a manufactured landscape. So what is the role that we anticipate tropical Andes will play in here is mostly associated with the idea that people have about ecosystem services, but not only those regulating systems, providing, for instance, carbon sequestration or water capture, nutrient cycling, pollination, etc. An ecosystem service that very few people have paid attention to is precisely the cultural ecosystem services that can be gathered from these mountains. However, some scholars have pointed that ecosystem services are kind of an anthropocentric view, is a utilitarian idea that mountains are there to provide us with resources. And that is actually now countered by a very interesting realization. We are dealing now with benefits from nature to people. Many of the things that we have in the tropical mountains are there, and some benefit us. They are not at our service, but it will be an interesting realization that, for instance, again, the sacred dimension, analyzing the provision of food based on sacred foods in the Andes, brings a very interesting chapter to understand this new trend of moving away from ecosystem services, highlighting the notion of benefits from nature to people instead in the tropical mountains. And so one of the benefits associated with that maintenance of the tree diversity is precisely identified rather well what are those species that are significant for the locals, and how those species could be incorporated into ecotourism projects that will allow actually to maintain a flow of resources, particularly financial support, to maintain these small private reserves. We came up with a very interesting study looking at how Montology is poised to help ecotourism in the Peruvian cloud forest areas. With my colleagues in Chachapoyas, we published this very interesting piece in the journal Pages, whereby we identified the need of incorporating a transdisciplinary approach to try to understand the nature and the culture of this ecosystem. It's called La Ceja de Selva. Because of that, new ways of approaches for the using of ecotourism have been generated in the area. Also, because of this change towards a post-growth economy, we are facing what most people call a transition. Some of you may be familiar with the demographic transition, or maybe the forestry transition. all of those transitions that are represented by a concept curve. This is very interesting because if you incorporate soil ecology, you see how the notion of the sacred was really very high in the pre-industrial economies. It became much less important in the industrial economies. But then when the countries became really rich, very affluent, the post-industrial economies highly value the sacred dimension. And so here, between the apprehensive culture to the prehensive culture, we move into the comprehensive culture of the future with an inverse concept curve. And that is somehow a very interesting realization that particularly in the mountainscape, heritage and territory planning are the most important fronts of scholarship of the future. In this way, I would like to leave you guys with this picture from a satellite image on the Chimborazo. The Chimborazo, which is the tallest mountain on Earth. The Chimborazo itself is a sacred mountain. It's one of the very important apus of the northern territory of the former Inca Empire. But when we look at the mountains, we see only the physical nature. We are lacking in the understanding of traditional and ancestral wisdom to understand how the mountains have interacted with the locals. Remember that Montology favors sustainable and regenerative development. We have to incorporate ideas that allow us to use conservation, particularly community-based conservation, not aiming the maintenance of the conditions of the system for perpetuity, but rather to incorporate possibilities to make regenerative development possible. That will be the only way in which we could conserve these mountains. Another important message that I would like for you to leave home with is actually an emphasis on education. A very recent article of my colleagues from the Universidad Toribio, Rodriguez de Mendoza, and Chachapoyas, and I look about education about mountains. This is missing, and that's very important to emphasize that Montology is providing a very interesting framework for how the transformation of our understanding about mountains is needed in the area. And not only that, but particularly highlighting the critical biogeography of these neotropical mountains with a panoptic approach to incorporate biocultural microrefugia conservation as an effort of community-based conservation in the Andes is possible. Here is my coda. I would like to end this symphony of information about tropical mountains with my Montology manifesto. I invite you to think of helping me to break old paradigms. We have to elucidate new paradoxes. We have to reconstruct myths, and we have to regenerate sentient mountains. With that, I will actually thank you very much. That concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, I will appreciate very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I know I'm not the only one clapping, but I'm just the only one you can see and hear right now.
Thank you.